and welcome to Retech, and today we're going to talk about the Commodore Amiga 600. And the A600 was an often kind of derided machine. Did it deserve its reputation of being an also-ran in the Commodore Amiga range, or was it because that people didn't understand the machine at the time? You see, the Amiga 600 was originally meant to be an Amiga A300, a kind of cut down A500, A500 Plus, and it had quite a few nice improvements that people at the time really didn't appreciate, maybe because a couple of the improvements were a little bit before its time, but also maybe because people didn't quite understand why Commodore was bringing out a cut down, cost reduced version of the Amiga 500 Plus and selling it at the same price as an Amiga 500 Plus. And you got to remember, the Amiga 500 Plus was a very short-lived model because of the Amiga 600, and there aren't that many 500 Plus machines around now. But the Amiga 500 was a brilliant success for Commodore. It basically turned around the Amiga line and the profits for Commodore at the time, and it got a massive foothold in the gaming market, a massive foothold in what it was termed as the new multimedia market at the time. And Commodore thought it could do one better and bring out a machine that was not as expensive to get an even bigger foothold in the market. But the problem with the Commodore 600, as it became known as later, was that it wasn't a massively spec'd up machine in comparison to the A500 Plus, but it had a few very nice features, and these features that the A600 had back then are the main features that keeps the Amiga 600 relevant today. And we're going to cover this within this video. Okay, so we're going to have a look at the baby Amiga, the Amiga 600, the middle machine between the 500 and the A1200. But before we do that, people often ask, are classic and vintage computers relevant today? Are they useful? Can they be used? Are they entertaining? Are they able to keep the modern child amused? Well, I believe so. So let's have a quick look at this.
Hello, future. No! 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 Stop hitting him! Ha! Cha! No! No! Austin, grapple up there! You have to. You have to. Stop moving, man. Go! Get up there. There you go. All you did is just bump into her. Grapple up! Kill! Yes! That way. Okay, try and grapple there, okay? You've got 2 lives dead already.
Okay, so as you can see, the 8-bit and 16-bit machines are a huge hit, and each and every time I put on a classic game and allow children, whether the friends of my children and so on, to play them, they spend hours playing platformers and racing games and shoot 'em up games, and they just seem to enjoy them, and the Amiga is no exception to this. In fact, the Amiga is possibly one of the platforms that children and kids and even adults enjoy the most. So let's take a look. Okay, so the Amiga 600, it's often a kind of a derided machine, and I'm not so sure why that is, because it's quite a nice looking machine. It certainly looks a lot more modern than the original 500 and the 500 Plus, and it's a very compact version of that same machine, because the Amiga 600 was meant to be a cost reduced Amiga 500, so it doesn't have the keypad on the side. It has your standard QWERTY keyboard, no keypad, no separate direction pad. It's all kind of combined within the main keyboard itself, but it's not a bad looking machine. In fact, I actually quite like its compact dimensions. It still has kind of the look of the Amiga 1200. It's very similar style. It still has a disk drive in the side. It has all of the ports that you would need on the back of the machine anyway, and it does have a few advantages. Now, this machine, it's very well built. In comparison to an Amiga 500 and 500 Plus, the plastics are massively improved. They are so much nicer, so much more sturdy. They're not as brittle. They tend not to yellow as much. This one's gone slightly on the spacebar here and a few of the keys along here, but in general it's in very, very good condition. Now, one of the biggest criticisms of the Amiga 600 was that it wasn't really an improvement over the Amiga 500. But did you need an improvement? Because a lot of people just look at it as a basic machine, a basic 500, a cut down 500, but was it really? I mean, if we pan up and you can actually hear the game running, it's actually quite decent. And the reason it looks quite decent on a LCD monitor is because it has composite built into the machine. It has composite audio left and right and composite video through on this machine, so it will work with relatively modern LCD TVs without a problem. Now you're going to say, well, the Amiga 500 could do that and it could do exactly the same as this, but could it? Because the Amiga 500 was a much larger machine. It also had a separate modulator to allow the video to go out from the machine to a TV, whether that was composite or RF, where this machine has everything in one very neat package. Now this is the Amiga 500. This is a very good condition Amiga 500, which hasn't really yellowed and has its original tank mouse, and you can see it's not a bad looking machine. It has a keyboard and it also has a separate keypad on the end here, but it is quite a large machine. It's very, very deep. You can just about sit a small LCD monitor on the back, and this was my machine of choice, and I could never work out the Commodore 600 at the time because it felt like it was a repackaged Amiga 500. But this is the part that always got me. It was this. It was the modulator with the video and audio in and out that actually sat on the back of the machine. You can see how big it really is, so you needed quite a hefty desktop space. So you had your audio coming into here and your RF if you're using TV out from there, or you would still need your audio in and your video out. This was composite on here, but you still needed this modulator. That's what really extended the footprint of this machine. I mean, at the time no one really worried. I mean, if you were lucky enough to have a monitor, you didn't need that, but it made this machine quite a huge machine. So if we do a comparison between this and the 600, there's a huge difference in size, and that gives you an idea of how big the 500 really was. It was quite a chunky machine, and as you can see, this 600 will run almost exactly the same software as the Commodore 500 and 500 Plus, and the 500 Plus is really the basis for the 600, because the 600 has the enhanced chipset in, where the original chipset, the OCS, was in the original A500. Now At the time, I didn't understand why people were so down on the Amiga 600, because it wasn't a bad machine and I liked its compact dimensions. I did get kind of suckered into the, well, it was not really an improvement on the A500 and what was the point of it, and you know, why bring out a 600 when you've always got a 500 plus and a 500 out there? Why can't we just, you know, do the step to the 1200? But this actually ended up replacing the 500 and 500 plus, and the reason behind that is that it was far too expensive to make it a cost reduced Amiga, and I'll go over the reasons why. But at the time, this machine was my brother's favourite machine, and I had the big 500 and or 500 plus at the time, and I always kind of looked at this machine thinking I quite like it, because when you used to go to computer fairs or computer meetings and, you know, basically all the sort of stuff that was going on at the time, you used to have to be able to bring your own machine, and it was so much easier to lug around this compared to that chunky 500 plus or the 500. And you know, you used to just chuck that in a backpack and off you go, where the you couldn't really find a backpack big enough for the 500 and 500 plus. So we're going to have a quick look at what made this machine an improvement over the 500 and 500 plus, because most people don't think there were many improvements to this machine. Well, the big improvement, and it is a huge improvement, was the feel of the keyboard. The 500 seemed to have a very different style makeup to its keyboard, so it felt rather mushy. Not as mushy as the really kind of terrible Atari ST keyboard, but it wasn't as nice to use as the Commodore A600, and maybe it was because it was a more compact keyboard, and also there was less flexing on the actual base for the keyboard as there was in the original 500 and 500 plus, but the keyboard was quite nice to type on. It was a markedly different experience, and you didn't really miss the number pad. I mean, how often did you really use it? Most people very rarely at the time. Now it's commonplace. You use the keypad for a lot of things on a modern computer, on a modern PC, but most people played games on these. There was very few people used them as very serious applications, and the layout of the Amiga 500 was more akin to a modern PC. But let's have a look at what this machine really had to offer. So let's take a look at the back of the machine. We have power, very standard power supply if you compare it to the Amiga 5 and 600, and it's also very similar to the Commodore 128. You also have RF out, which is, you know, at the time was a handy thing to have, but then you have composite built in, so you have audio and video built into the machine on here itself. You also have a video port, and then you have the normal kind of disk drive port, serial and parallel ports along the side here, and basically it wasn't a badly spec'd out machine, and it had really all of the features that the Commodore Amiga A500 and 500 Plus had, but in a very compressed package. So you're going to say, where's the joystick port? Is it like the Atari ST underneath the machine? Well, no. Your joystick and mouse ports are on the side, very handily located, with your disk drive, which is packaged on a slight slant in comparison to the kind of more flatter 500. And then you have a PCM slot, which was really handy. At the time not many people used it, but as these machines got older and these PCM cards basically became more abundant and more readily available, it became a very good way of adding storage to this machine on a card, basically. If you remember, you might remember some of the early laptops. They were really pushing this, and the Amiga 600 kind of benefited from that as the machines kind of matured and the technology matured and the price dropped for these things. Now, one of the biggest things people are going to say is, well, really a PCM slot and a nicer design of case and a slightly better plastics and a slightly nicer keyboard, that's not really going to make people rush out and buy it. And to be honest, it didn't initially, and it wasn't until people kind of realized that, hang on, we have PCs with hard drives built in, and because of that, people were now looking to the Amiga and thinking, can we put a hard drive on this? Well, on the Amiga you have to have a massive big extension of a hard drive which bolted onto the side, and it was very, very noisy. On the Amiga 600 you could use a built-in hard drive. It has its own hard drive port inside, and the machine was actually shipped at times with a built-in hard drive, very similar to the Amiga 1200, or you could add one in yourself. I mean, this machine has never had one. That's going to be my next step, is to take it from a non-hard drive based machine, take it away from the floppy drive and put a modern SD or PCM style credit card hard drive in this machine to make it more useful, and then I can put all of my software onto the hard drive and run it from there, and also update the workbench that's run on these machines as well. But that's a little kind of project for the future on one of these, because this one has remained standard all of this time, completely sealed, never opened. So I'm in two minds whether or not to leave this one as unopened with the seals intact, or get another 600 that has been opened and then start playing around with it and making them a little bit more usable in the 21st century. But the Amiga 600 was not a bad machine. It was very, very nice to use, well built, had a few nice additions to it, such as the ability to put an internal hard drive in, and also a PCM CIA slot on the side. And that to me was the clincher, really. It was something I thought, well, maybe I should go out and get myself a 600. But at the time, the Amiga 1200 was coming onto the market with the same capabilities, such as the internal hard drive, the PCM slot, a slightly nicer keyboard, a more modern look, and that's the route I eventually went. And the 600 kind of became a little bit forgotten about until I recently got hold of another one, and this is the machine here. And since then I haven't really used my 500 or my 5 Plus. This has been the kind of go-to machine for the Commodore Amiga, because most of the software runs nicely on the A600, and it doesn't seem to have the floppy drive incompatibility that the Amiga 1200 had, which enabled most of the software to run. Okay, so if you look on the screen now, we've got the specifications of this machine. It had a Motorola 68000 at 7.16 megahertz in NTSC, or 7.09 megahertz in PAL. It had 1 megabyte of RAM, chip RAM, which was better than the original A500, so it was almost twice the capacity, and it could be upgraded by another 1 meg in the trapdoor expansion slot on the bottom. But you could use 4 megabytes in PCM CIA slot and up to 64 meg on unofficial expansions. The operating system was Amiga OS 2.5 up to 3.1 on ROM. The predecessor of this machine was the 500 and 500 Plus, but the successor was the Amiga 1200. Now, the 600 really was the last model to use the enhanced chipset, the ECS chipset, which they originally kind of started off on the unofficially on the Amiga 500 Plus, because there was a half ECS chipset in some of the early models of the 500, but the ECS really started to ship in the 500 plus. And it also had the Super Agnes display chip, which can drive screen modes from 320 by 200 to 1280 by 512. But they didn't improve the sound much. It kind of stayed the same with the 4 DMA 8-bit channels and 2 for left and right speakers respectively. So that didn't really change. So they didn't improve the sound hardware. But to be honest, at the time, the sound hardware wasn't really an issue on these machines, because it was arguably better than most other machines that were out there. And as we said, the ports covered 2 for joysticks, mice or light pens, 25-pin RS-232 serial port, a 25-pin Centronics parallel port, and it's basically compatible with nearly every peripheral from the early Amiga range, such as MIDI, sound samplers and video capture devices. And the expansion capabilities were the new PCM CIA Type 2 slot and the internal 44-pin ATA interface, and it was the same hard drive interface that you would see on laptops of the time. Now the PCM CIA slot was the 16-bit card slot, so many of the later 32-bit card bus peripherals are incompatible. And it's really designed for Type 1 and Type 2 cards. Type 3 won't fit, but you can get the Type 3 to fit with an adapter or remove the case, which is not really a good way of doing it. But it's not particularly fully compliant with the PCM CIA Type 2 standards, because it was put into place before the standard was finalized. And really, as I said, you could use it as basically a hard drive on the side, but you really had to wait for that to happen with a compact flash adapter. But you know, the options were there from the start. So thank you for having a look with the Amiga 600 with me, and you will see that it is a really nice machine. It's well built, it's got a nice keyboard, it has PCM CIA slot built into it, it has a hard drive port built into it. It was more upgradable in that fashion than the 500, because you could keep it all within a single small footprint case. There was no noisy hard drive bolted onto the side. And now, using modern technology with SD cards, SD adapters, silent hard drives, basically, these machines are more relevant now than they actually were, and they're easier to use. So in conclusion, the Amiga 600 was a good machine. It was kind of overlooked and probably a little bit misunderstood at the time, and that's a shame, because if you've got one now, get yourself an internal hard drive or an internal card, then put everything you want on that drive and then enjoy the machine for what it was. And it was a fantastic machine, and most of them survive better than the original 500. Obviously the 1200 is its big brother, but either machine is a worthy addition and a worthy machine to use for your entertainment, your nostalgic kick, and also as a machine in general. So thanks for watching. I hope you subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.